One of the reasons I really love Oncorhynchus micus, right, just aka rainbow trout or steelhead, is that they are so flexible in what they do. They have what we refer to in biology as a lot of plasticity, and that is basically a rainbow trout can produce a steelhead and a steelhead can produce a rainbow trout. And we even have really good evidence that rainbow trout that have been landlocked for really long periods of time, centuries, often still produce smolts.
Welcome to In the Bucket, the podcast that explores the culture of spay fishing in the Pacific Northwest, a spectacular land of mountains and wild rivers where every cast has a story to tell. I'm your host, Brian Niska.
In today's show, I'm going to be learning more about the conservation angler, or TCA as it's often referred to. I'll be speaking with our friend John McMillan, president of TCA, and one of his board members, noted author and publisher Tom Perro. These two gentlemen have a long history in fisheries conservation and also happen to be passionate anglers. Personally, I'm very excited to feature TCA as our conservation partner in our recently announced Wet Fly Swing Skeena Steelhead School promotion. I have a tremendous amount of respect for this organization and the people involved. Let's get into it.
Well, folks, thanks for joining us today. I'm really excited to have John McMillan and Tom Perro on the show today. We're going to talk about the conservation angler. John, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, Brian. So I'm the president of the conservation angler, and it's an exciting time for us. We're going through a bit of a transition, but my formal training is in science, right? So basically for the past 27 or 28 years, I've been a scientist. I live down here on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. So I grew up along the banks of the Washougal River, which is a relatively small to intermediate sized tributary that dumps into the Columbia right at the mouth of the Columbia River Gorge. So I was raised basically as a small steelhead bum. You know, my dad was Bill McMillan. He grew up steelheading. My grandfather steelheaded. My great-grandfather steelhead fished. So it's been, as Hank Williams Jr. would say, a family tradition for me. And that love of steelheading as a young kid, and it carried over throughout my entire life. And so I moved up to Forks in the late 1990s after I graduated from college to take an internship with the United States Forest Service. That led to a job with the Hoh Indian tribe. So then I went to work for the Wild Salmon Center. During that period, you know, I was basically snorkeling rivers like the Hoh, the Quileute, in Forks, Washington. I went back to grad school, which was a great time. Then I came back up to the Olympic Peninsula to work on the Elwha Dam removal project. I took a job then with Trout Unlimited, and for the last 3 years, I've been working with the conservation angler. And the real reason I wanted to come to the conservation angler was not only because it's an angler-based NGO, but I wanted to go over to Russia, right, to spend my summers in Kamchatka studying the last untouched populations of wild summer steelhead. But the Ukraine-Russia war put the kibosh on that. So that's a little bit of my background.
Thanks, John. And to our listeners, if that sounds familiar, it's because you may recall John joined us on In the Bucket number 11 with Bob Hooton and Brian Morrison. So, John, it's wonderful to have you back, and I really enjoyed the Outlaw Country reference as I grew up listening to that stuff on fishing adventures with my dad and brother. So, Tom, let's get into your background a little bit, because you haven't been on here before, but you and I met briefly years ago at an event I used to put on in Squamish called Cast and Blast. But as we discussed previous, some of the magazines and books that you've produced over the years have been very influential for me and my own passion for steelhead fishing.
Well, thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. I grew up in New England and fished for stock trout and striped bass and largemouth bass and many, many different species. And I became involved with an organization called Trout Unlimited when I was a teenager. As a matter of fact, when I was 17 years old, I was the youngest chapter president in the organization's history, and maybe still am, actually, in that respect. But I became involved with local stream restoration projects and other fisheries activities. And then I applied for the job of editor of Trout Magazine, the organization's publication, which at the time was very modest. And I got the job, much to the surprise and delight of my mother, who was afraid I was going to live in her house forever. And that led me to move to Oregon in 1984. I moved to Oregon to fish the North Umpqua and the Lower Deschutes, and so ended up in Bend, sort of halfway between those great rivers. And then one thing led to another, and I met a gentleman named Pete Soverell, retired Navy captain in the late 80s and early 90s. And we conspired to form an organization called the Wild Salmon Center, which eventually became this organization that we're talking about, the Conservation Angler. The Wild Salmon Center still exists, but in a different form from the way we organized it. And we can go into that a little later. And then over the years, as you alluded to, I have been involved in various magazine projects, Wild Steelhead and Atlantic Salmon, the large format publication that so many people fondly remember, and Fish and Fly magazine. And then for the past 20 years or so, I've been publishing books, including A Passion for Steelhead, Wild Steelhead, Atlantic Salmon Magic, etc.
And Tom, for folks listening, your publishing isn't limited to fly fishing topics, is it? It's actually quite a wide range of activities.
Yeah, the core of it is fishing, but I've also published some hunting books, several grouse books, and I published a book about the life of Ernest Hemingway and a book about the Civil War Battle of Gettysburg. So I've kind of gone down a few rabbit holes.
History is important, though, isn't it?
Well, I think so. It's especially important to what we do in trying to conserve these fisheries and rivers, because if you don't know what they were historically, how do you know what you're trying to restore or even save, for that matter? I mean, there's this famous, in modern conservation science, there's this famous phrase called the shifting baseline, which John, as a professional, can explain better than I. But essentially, every generation has a lowered expectation of what a fishery should be or how abundant fish should be in a particular watershed or river.
The shifting baseline idea is very important, isn't it? Because, if someone started fishing 10 years ago, what are they going to know about what things were like in the 50s, 60s, 70s? And sometimes I question personal recollections of the past. I think time does charm it a little bit. Today's social media environment, on one hand, is quite toxic, and I really dislike social media for that. I always picture these trolls, hiding out in their mom's basement, just saying negative things to everybody and getting some sort of personal satisfaction about that disruption they're creating. But at the same time, I think respect is important. And if someone's sharing a recollection of their past, a fishing trip, telling you about fish they caught, how big they think they were, someone wants to jump all over them, tell them their fish was smaller than they thought, or something like that, I think that's really bad. But one thing I do enjoy with social media, and I think it's moved the needle quite a bit, and you guys may disagree with me, and that's okay, is I think that our tolerance for poor fish handling has diminished. I think in today's social media atmosphere, if someone was to hold a fish out of the water for too long, there's going to be people correcting them. And I think the upside to that is now the style of photography that is prevalent is, the steelheads in the water. And, I guess on one hand, I'm bothered by the fact that a lot of folks think it's important to take pictures of every fish. But John, you and I had this discussion the other day, just talking, and, maybe mistakes that we've made in the past probably need to be tolerant and let other people make those mistakes for themselves. But at the same time, I think, education is important. And that's the neat thing about talking to folks who have more experience than yourself is what you can pick up off of it. And obviously bringing it back to books and magazines, Tom, that's a big motivator, I hope, for people who publish those things and write those articles, is to pass on their knowledge.
Well, actually, I'm right on the verge of sending a book to press called A Passion for Bonefish. Not exactly our topic here today, but it illustrates the book, a big 400-page glossy book, as typical of some of my higher-end pieces are, illustrates your very point. There are hundreds of photos of fishing and fish, and the only dead ones, or the ones held out of the water, are from the 1950s and 40s. And they're to illustrate anglers, Ted Williams, Joe Brooks, etc.
I think this discussion is really important. And Brian, you highlight, and Tom does too, I think, two of the fundamental challenges that we have to both managing fish and conserving them. And, as you alluded to, there is a scientific component to the shifting baseline. And that was a term that was invented by Daniel Pauly, who is a scientist, and basically it refers to this concept that every generation comes to accept what they experience as the new normal, their baseline. And we're all guilty of that, right? Because it's very difficult for any of us to have a strong scientific understanding of what existed 100 years ago, because the type of science that we do today was not being conducted back then. And if you go back longer than a couple hundred years in North America, we get to what we refer to as time immemorial. And that basically means that we didn't have any living memory of it. So it's very difficult when you didn't have any living memory, at least it's been passed along generationally, to how many fish there were. So that means to me, scientifically, we have a challenge in conserving fish because each generation comes to accept what they experience as the norm, the new baseline. And one example of that for me is I was born into a period of steelhead greatness. I had my coming of age during the mid to late 1980s when ocean survival for steelhead was exceptionally high. And I came to expect that steelhead fishing would always be like it was. And then I also came to experience the early to mid 1990s in the Columbia River when all of the runs basically tanked. Many of the people who loved steelhead fishing moved on to, enjoy other pastimes, maybe other species of fish, rather than steelhead because those declines were so substantial. And then I was fortunate enough to stay in the sport because I loved it. And then we experienced the early 2000s, which was this, again, a great reinvigoration of steelhead and salmon with dramatic improvements in ocean survival. And so we've and then, Brian, you've been through this, we're a similar age. And then we experienced the last 8 to 9 years, right, where runs once again plummeted down with, partly to blame because of these changes in ocean survival, the blob in the North Pacific. So I go back to the shifting baseline by Pauly, as it's very difficult to conserve an animal when people come to have a belief that is based on what they experience, that is the normal. Part of this has occurred where I live on the Olympic Peninsula. When I was working with the Wild Salmon Center, my dad, being the historian like Tom that he is, went through a bunch of old records and found cannery data and old catch data for Olympic Peninsula wild winter steelhead. And it was pretty shocking to see how many fish were being harvested back in the 1930s through the 1950s. And when he analyzed that data in a relatively rudimentary form, it illustrated that there were probably a lot more fish back then than we thought there were today. And so 3 or 4 years ago, I decided to revisit that information, and we published a paper on that generated these historical estimates for Olympic Peninsula winter run steelhead. And they all suggested the run sizes were significantly larger back in the 1950s and early 60s than they are today. And the cannery record that we had from the Queets in 1938 suggested even larger run sizes. Now, I'll use this as one example. It's the extreme end. This was the largest run size that we had, and I believe it was 1954 in the Queets River. And that was a run size of approximately 40 to 50,000 winter steelhead. More importantly is the tribe did 5,000 steelhead in just the month of December alone. And this is important because today's managers, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, had long promulgated this falsehood that there were no early entering wild steelhead, and ergo they could have these early timed hatchery fish that had no effect on the winter runs, because if they had these hatchery fish returning from late November through early January, there was basically no opportunity to overlap with wild winter runs that they suggested did not really start spawning until mid-March and really did not begin entering the river until sometime in late January. Now, that is one of the reasons it's really important to evaluate and analyze historical data, because this was the only way we were able to statistically show in a rigorous and unbiased way that the populations have changed over time, and that one of the likely reasons they've changed over time is because the institutional knowledge from those early biologists at the department did not carry on and were not passed along to the biologists we have today. So there has been a shifting baseline in terms of science, what people come to understand. More importantly to me is not only was the wild steelhead run timing much broader than it is now, but that the Quileute language for the local Native American tribe that calls the Quileute River home, their language referred to the month of January as the timing of steelhead entry, and the month of February as the timing of steelhead spawning. So these are really trying to hearken back to what we would call First Nation indigenous knowledge, right? These are important points that we have, baselines, right? These are just important cultural touchstones, I guess, is more the appropriate language that we would use today. And so that conflicts with what these modern managers in the Department of Fish and Wildlife have come to accept as the status quo. Now, I can tell you, science in and of itself, we all know that there's a lot of strong science out there that people don't believe. So science in and of itself is not going to change everybody's mind, but it's an important piece of information that we can use to kind of try and correct this shifting baseline syndrome. But the second part is relatively long-winded to get at. The second part is what you mentioned, which is there's a social shifting baseline. I used to lay all my I fish alone. So the only way I could get a photograph of a steelhead was to lie it in the shallows right next to a rod. And those photographs are generally not well accepted anymore. In fact, over the last 7 to 8 years, I've kind of stopped taking photographs of fish at all, right? I've caught enough fish. I don't need to see it. So I think, socially, social media has played a role in kind of changing the shifting baseline ourselves in a positive way, right? We don't handle fish the same way we did back in the 80s and 90s. We've improved our fish handling. So a short way to say that scientifically the shifting baseline can hurt us, but socially the shifting baseline in terms of how we handle fish has probably actually improved the way anglers interact with the animal that we love.
Brian, I'd like to make a point here that is central to what the conservation angler is all about, and that's the fact that we as a group, as a nonprofit organization, are organized around and are led by anglers. There's no other important fish conservation group on the Pacific coast who can claim that. Why is that important? Well, consider what John McMillan, our president, just explained, that the fishing, the sport fishing, the fly fishing in our case, for example, Sole Duck River began after Thanksgiving in December and ran strongly all through the winter. And we have to look no farther than the historical figure of Sid Glasso to recognize that. He wasn't out casting his silk lines into which he worked lead paint. Yeah, that's pretty crazy, but that's what he did to get them down. He wasn't out there on December 10 doing that because the fish might show up in March. The fish were there. And one of the things, I think, the important points that John made, and one of the strategies that we bring to the whole fisheries conservation scene is not simply quantity or the numbers of salmon increasing collectively, for instance, but the timing of these runs. So in our case, as anglers, if you have a limited season on some of these rivers that lasts for a month and a half because the managers now think they're conserving the earlier fish, that's stealing opportunity from anglers. We want those early fish back. And that's one of the things, one of the voices that John brings to this important matter. When were the fish here? Were they here for just March and April? No, they came in as early as December and lasted all winter.
FishHound Expeditions offers world-class fly fishing right off Alaska's incredible road system. From monster rainbow trout to feisty Arctic grayling, you'll chase big species in the stunning landscape. Whether you're a seasoned angler or just starting out, their expert guides ensure an unforgettable adventure. Book your trip today before spots fill up and experience Alaska's diversity like never before. Check them out right now. That's FishHoundExpeditions.com. This year, I ventured into the heart of eastern Idaho's Yellowstone Teton territory where the fish were larger than life and the waters held the secrets of the best fly fishing out west. With crystal clear rivers like the Henry's Fork and the South Fork of the Snake and enough lakes to keep you going all year long, make your way to Yellowstone Teton territory and embark on a journey to one of North America's finest fly fishing destinations. It's time to experience eastern Idaho for yourself and support this podcast at the same time.
So for me, up here in BC, one of the things that is a source of constant frustration is I feel that the folks that manage our fisheries don't participate in the level that I would like. And what I mean by that is simply put, I just don't see them out there fishing. And I think that anglers interact with, the fish and the environment in a much different way than your typical scientist might. And their understanding of the fishery and, how anglers space themselves, the times of day they might fish, what triggers, heavy participation. And obviously, I don't want to get into the weeds again on social media, but, social media certainly changed that, right? In the old days, people could keep their secrets. And now, with Google Earth and Instagram and things like that, you got to be very careful because the spot can get blown up pretty quick. But with all that being said, when it comes to managing anglers, the levers that we have here in BC are pretty limited. If we don't think there's enough fish, we talk about closures. If there's lots of fish, then it's open. Historically, like fairly recently, there's been battles for bait bans. We don't talk about fly fishing only. That's something that isn't really considered a tool in the toolbox these days here in BC. But the three of us know that if you make a river fly fishing only, you're going to change the amount of fish that are being caught. And you could take it a step further. You could make it harder to catch them on the fly. Certainly, we've seen developments in tackle that make us more productive, and I'm speaking specifically to sinking lines and flies that move like lures. Dry line only. That's not a crazy thought. That's a regulation that's been used successfully in other parts of the world, other parts of this country. So, personally, what I would like to see moving forward is our managers find a way to weaponize the angler impact for science. And I think that your organization is uniquely positioned, to help them with that. And I'm not just talking locally. This could be a global thing because fishermen, we love to fish. We love to tell stories. We're observant by nature. We're optimistic by nature. But I think a lot of times our data comes into suspect because of our fish stories. And one thing that I think we're all guilty of is we take our own personal experience. So I caught 2 fish today in a particular run. So thus I assume the river's full of fish. And so we extrapolate our own success into a greater representation of, the health of the resource. What do you guys think?
I think it's a good point, and if I think about this brings me back to where I think TCA has a niche and a role to play because, for us, we were largely founded around this kind of angler science program that we developed, that Pete developed, right, in Kamchatka, working with a couple of CIA agents, as I've talked about before in a podcast when I interviewed Pete, right? This was an interesting program, right? The Soviet Union collapsed. That had a great social change, and that opened up Kamchatka to a collaboration between scientists at Moscow State University in Russia, Pete, Tom, and anglers under the umbrella of TCA, and then scientists here in the United States, right, including people like Jack Stanford, who used to run the Flathead Biological Station at University of Montana. And so this is a real collaborative effort between two countries where anglers would pay an amount of money, donate basically, and this money would help fund scientific research and that the anglers would go over there and catch steelhead, and the Russian and American scientists would sample, collect DNA, they would collect scales, they would tag fish. So this type of information basically really improved the extent of knowledge that the Russians had on these steelhead. I won't say more importantly, but as importantly, one of the reasons the Russians were concerned and were interested in this type of program was that the steelhead on Kamchatka, despite existing in what is very pristine habitat, right, has not been altered at all. The steelhead were suffering. Their populations had been depleted because there were people poaching salmon for caviar, and the steelhead were being caught in those poaching efforts. So the money not only that was generated by these angler science programs not only went to help collect information, but eventually that generated more broad support from foundations and scientists, and that money helped generate what is called an anti-poaching campaign over there. And those anti-poaching campaigns that were being run by the Russian government helped produce a great reduction in the amount of steelhead that were being illegally taken by these caviar poachers. And that has continued to this day. And so what they saw was that when the steelhead were being really depleted by these poachers, that the population shifted, transitioned to mostly rainbow trout. And the steelhead population also started to show a very high level of repeat spawners because the maiden or the first-time spawners were being killed at really high levels. And which is something you're familiar with, Brian. We've talked about this in the Thompson, right? When steelhead go down, you can see a transition to more rainbow trout. But once the anti-poaching campaign had been underway for 5 to 7, 8 years, the steelhead life history, the one that went to the ocean that had been being poached, started to dramatically increase, and there were fewer rainbow trout. So in other words, TCA played a really critical role in collaborating with Moscow State University and the Russian government. And what we saw was that steelhead that had been depleted, not because of habitat, but because of overfishing, began to recover. And now we see very strong runs of steelhead over there in Russia. Of course, they vacillate annually and over longer periods in relation to ocean conditions. But the point is that not all of our populations of steelhead and salmon are depleted because the habitat has been altered, right? And we see that even with Alaskan Chinook. And Brian, you live in places in BC where you've seen depletion. And I think that is where TCA sees its role, that when you look at this very crowded conservation community or ecosystem across most of North America that exists along this Pacific Rim from Alaska down into the lower 48 where I'm at, most of those NGOs focus on habitat work, right? They do habitat work. They also participate in policy meetings, and they try and enforce or generate large policy changes that can have benefits to the fish. Now, where I live in the lower 48, there was a recent paper that brings to question whether that effort has been effective. Now, it's a well-intended effort. I'm not going to criticize people. Habitat is fundamental to recovering any animal. But a paper by Yeager and Sherrill in the Columbia River evaluated what I call the grand experiment. And I grew up in the Columbia River Basin. Basically, over 40 years, $9 billion were spent to recover salmon and steelhead, passing Bonneville Dam. And the goal set back in the mid-1990s was to have 5 million adult salmon and steelhead passing Bonneville by the year 2025. So we're about 20 days away from that, right? You know, that kind of goal being approached. And $9 billion, of that $9 billion, about 40% was spent on habitat restoration and hatcheries. And the rest of the money was used to monitor, research, and kind of implement, right? Because there's a cost to trying to implement this type of program. Unfortunately, we are nowhere close to this 5 million fish goal passing Bonneville. In fact, many of the populations are worse off now than when those efforts started. And this also just brings to the point, is a strong focus on using hatcheries to try and rebuild wild stocks and then trying to restore habitat and reopen habitat. Are those efforts in and of themselves going to recover fish that are listed under the Endangered Species Act? And I think the evidence is pretty clear that most of those efforts again, though very well intended, have not had the return on the investment that people had hoped for. And this is not to be universally critical of efforts to restore habitat or use hatchery fish to recover wild fish. We know that hatcheries, for example, have been used to stave off extinction in a number of places, and that hatcheries are the only way in some rivers that are so degraded that people are ever going to have fisheries. But what this does highlight to me, and I think this is a strategy that came to rise when I was working at the Wild Salmon Center, something that Pete Soverel and Guido Rahr and Zan Ojero, we all played a role in, is that there are, initially this term was referred to as salmon refuges. Now it's called strongholds. But the concept is that some watersheds and populations of fish have sufficient resilience in them, remain in good enough shape that we actually, one, either can restore them to some modicum of resilience and former abundance, or two, is that they are sufficiently still intact, places like the Skeena, that you have to be preventative to ensure that those rivers and populations don't fall into the same, kind of shenanigans or bad practices that our watersheds have fallen into in the lower 48. So this is where I see TCA's role, is that we are anglers. We want to provide a role that complements this habitat work. We're also willing to take on some of the more difficult battles that other NGOs don't want to take on. And for that reason, I consider us to be a group of science and law. Our mission is very simple. We want to save wild steelhead and salmon. Mostly, though, we're steelheaders. And when you talk about trying to save wild salmon, there's one species that we really focus on because we love to fish, and that is Chinook salmon. Right? And recovering steelhead and Chinook salmon in and of themselves is a very difficult task, but this is what we want to do. And we don't just want to do it in the lower 48. We want to expand our geographic scope. So as the Russian-Ukraine war resulted in us kind of not being able to conduct the type of angler science project that we were doing in Russia, our efforts are now coming back home to North America. And this is one reason that we're going through a transition. One reason that I've been put in the position of president is so that we can use really good science and conduct good science more broadly geographically, and that when necessary, we can litigate to ensure that agencies are going to enforce the laws that are in place to protect fish. Because if we don't manage our hatcheries and fisheries more effectively, we're not going to get the return on investment from our habitat projects.
Tom, you were involved early on in the Russian program. What lessons can be learned from the collaborative approach that was successful there?
Oh, well, I mean, there's so many fascinating outcomes from that Kamchatka effort. I mean, first of all, it proved how quickly, assuming the habitat is there, that effort, the anti-poaching effort there that John describes, proved how quickly a wild run of steelhead can recover, left out on its own. As Soverel likes to say, the fish know what to do. We don't have to tell them how to spawn. So there's that, but there's also what John could explain in more detail, but this whole intricate overlapping life histories that not only was discovered and documented, but also developed before our eyes. And that diversity, I think the most precious foundation of any wild population of fish. And that's what we stand for. We stand for more fishing opportunities, not fewer, through expanding wild population. I like to think of us as sort of the head of the spear. I would reiterate the point that John made about habitat. There's lots of work going on all throughout North America, in fact, the world, to save and improve habitat. And all of us applaud that. We've all been part of those efforts. But we're to the point now with steelhead here on the west coast of North America, where lots of groups are doing habitat work, government, private, tribal, etc. And somebody's got to step up for exactly and precisely what will bring back the wild steelhead to these watersheds that are improving in many cases, improving from bad forestry practices of the past. Dams are being taken down. We're positioning ourselves with science and exemplified by John McMillan, expertise, what do these fish need to recover and return as quickly as possible? I'd like to tell just a very quick story that illustrates the point about habitat and harvest. There's a big fight going on the East Coast right now. I just got back from Cape Cod last month visiting old friends and learned shockingly, although not surprisingly, that there's an entire year class of striped bass, which is the principal game fish on the East Coast. There's an entire year class simply missing. And this is big stuff. I mean, this is a major industry there. It would be as if an entire year class of all species of salmon here on the Pacific Coast just was gone. And the finger points to this insidious fishery for their main forage called a menhaden, which is kind of like a herring, a fattened, flattened, herring-looking fish. There's a fishery in Chesapeake Bay where most of these striped bass spawn for these menhaden, a commercial fishery that's euphemistically called a reduction fishery. And a relatively small fleet, like a half a dozen boats or so, go out and using spotter planes, they find these menhaden schools seasonally, and then these purse seiners swoop in and scoop them up to the tune of 100 million pounds of fish a year. And they grind them up in one plant in a place called Reedsport, Virginia, for use as cat food and lipstick and fertilizer. Delightful. Destroying the striped bass, wild striped bass fishery on the entire East Coast. And Chesapeake Bay, by the way, is now in better shape than it's been in at least 100 years. It's the famous source of oysters, etc. But that's where Baltimore is. And 50 years ago or more, you had all these noxious steel mills in the Susquehanna River coming down from Pennsylvania, pumping all these fertilizers into Chesapeake Bay. That is by no means solved, but it's a lot better now than it was. Okay, so the habit here you have that the clean water improving, habitat getting better, and the striped bass population collapsing. Why? Because of the destruction of their main forage fish. So that's just an example of where the focus needs to be at some point on the fish themselves, letting more get upstream, letting more spawn to recover the population.
I think you raise a good point, Tom, and I should be clear, most of our steelhead populations there's not a lot of evidence they're being overfished per se, right? I mean, so when I talk about managing fisheries better for a species like steelhead, in some cases we're just talking about the concept, and I like to put it this way, which is, do you want to fish today at the expense of fishing tomorrow? So I'm not doing this work so I can have more opportunity to fish today. But I think Brian hit on a good point, which is that many of the recreational fisheries that we have for steelhead, they're either closed or open, right? When they're closed, when the run is low, or it's a free-for-all when the run is good. And TCA has at times in the past, once or twice, advocated or tried to leverage the concept of closing a fishery. Almost universally, both of those occurred when the runs were at record low levels, right? We don't want to close fisheries. Unfortunately, at times, though, people advocate for that. We, formerly I think in the Deschutes River, a few years back when the run was predicted to be, in the low hundreds of fish, right? Very small run. Ideally, you don't have to advocate for closure. And I think moving forward, we're going to alter that strategy, which is we've got to work with agencies to try and come up with more flexible solutions, right, Brian? This is talking about, okay, if the run is really low, you can still have a fishery. Let's talk about limited entry. You could have so many rod days per week. You could have a cap on the number of fish that are caught. Whatever it is, there are a number of ways you could go to, no fishing from boats. I'm not talking about just the Deschutes. I'm talking more broadly here, right? During low run years, you could talk about no bait. You could talk about, shifting away from any lead or weight on the type of lure or fly that is used. In some cases, you could do like they've done with bow hunting, right? Bow hunting only and hunting. They have all of these tools in their toolbox for hunting. And I think that's one of the reasons we've successfully managed many of our big game and bird hunting places, that we have regulations in place and they're quite flexible. There's a lot of tools in the toolbox. And I think we need to think about how we're going to implement those types of tools moving forward, because climate change is a real threat to these fish. In the next 100 years, the temperatures and the stream flows are all expected to dramatically change, and fish are going to need every ounce of diversity they can muster to remain resilient and continue to support the fisheries that we all love. And so, recovering steelhead today is not necessarily, a fishery-based issue per se, but the way we manage fisheries today, as we've learned from our history, can have an impact on what the fish do 50 years from now. And so I think about our recreational fisheries for steelhead as they're not necessarily, there's no evidence that these fisheries are limiting the way steelhead, how productive they are today. But we also need to think about what the fish are going to need tomorrow. And I think that we have a lot of tools in the toolbox where we can have fisheries when run sizes are low to allow people to be on the river, because I do believe in what Pete Soverel has long told me, which is that a river without anglers or fishers is a river without advocates. And we're the ones that really care about these fish.
That's a great point, John, and I appreciate you bringing it up, because I think there's some real benefits to having anglers on the water, social benefits, economic benefits. Hey, you want to talk poaching? I'll bet you if you look at the records up here, anybody in the last decade that's been caught poaching was initially reported by a law-abiding angler. Furthermore, I think the presence of law-abiding anglers dissuades poaching activity. That's common sense, and I see that myself. I'm very quickly going to tell you a story. Years ago, I guided on the Bulkley, and then when that was kind of done, I would stick around and fish. And, this would be, November, so it's late season. November in Bulkley country is often kind of a winter month, and at that time there wasn't a lot of tourists. And I would drift down the river, and I'd have the place to myself, and I'd pull into a run, and then I'd say, oh, there's a guy fishing on the other side. Oh, look, he's parked right beside where he's fishing. Well, this is interesting. I kind of starved for human contact. I'll pull across from him and I'll fish and I'll see what he's doing. And this guy look all pissed off and get in his vehicle and drive away. And this happened a few times to me. And then I clued into what was going on. They call this Christmas salmon. Basically, that guy was looking to catch a fish, put it in his vehicle, and get the heck out of there. And because I pulled in across from it, pissed him off, and he had to go elsewhere. So this is stuff I learned over time. But, your point about climate change is relevant here, too, because what we've seen in the last few years is a move to a later start to proper winter, essentially a more milder autumn. And with that comes increased fishing activity for summer run steelhead in the months of November and even December. Now, historically, maybe December impacts from recreational fishing to summer run steelhead weren't a concern in Skeena country because, it was winter. But now with this milder weather, it is worth the discussion of, hey, at what point do we give these fish a break? How many times do they need to be caught as they're, starting to shut down to overwinter? So, if I was in charge, one of the things I personally would look at is wrapping up summer steelhead fishing sometime during the month of November and not allowing access in December. One other thing I wanted to bring up based on, the points you were making there earlier is this idea of the relationship between resident rainbow trout and anadromous steelhead. John, you've probably done more work on this topic than anyone. Can you get into that a little bit for our listeners?
Sure. So one of the reasons I really love Oncorhynchus micus, right, just aka rainbow trout or steelhead, is that they are so flexible in what they do. They have what we refer to in biology as a lot of plasticity, and that is basically a rainbow trout can produce a steelhead and a steelhead can produce a rainbow trout. And we even have really good evidence that rainbow trout that have been landlocked for really long periods of time, centuries, often still produce smolts, right? And a smolt is just a precursor to a steelhead. That's a small juvenile fish that undergoes a physiological change that prepares it to go to the ocean. And when a fish starts to undergo that change, it stimulates it to move downstream behaviorally, right? This to me is really interesting that steelhead in and of themselves, what we refer to as a steelhead, it doesn't necessarily depend on what their parents did. When I grew up as a kid, if their dad was a mill worker, their son might become a mill worker. And that's kind of a lot of the history, I think, for Europe and America, is that what your dad did, the child might do. And this is where steelhead are really cool. Sure, most of many steelhead offspring become steelhead, but not all of them do, just as many resident rainbow trout offspring become resident trout, but not all do. And there are a couple of underlying factors. I like to look at environmental extremes so people can understand this. There's an underlying cause, which is that the more food and fat that are in fresh water, the better the growth opportunity is for a juvenile mycus, and the more likely they are to become resident. They don't need to undertake a very risky ocean migration where survival might only be 5 to 4%, maybe 10% in a good year. And no place is this better illustrated than places like Bristol Bay in Alaska, right, where you've got basically very few to no steelhead, but you've got very, very large resident rainbow trout. And that is because the nutrients from they don't have to go to the ocean to get those nutrients. They come back into fresh water from salmon and salmon flesh and salmon eggs. And so those places that are very productive can produce lots of resident rainbow trout.
So, John, essentially what you're saying is if the sockeye runs were to crash, the logical response from steelhead might be a move to a more anadromous lifestyle.
I would think so. I mean, somebody else said this, John Thorpe. Anadromy is a response to freshwater adversity. And I think of the little town that I grew up in. I don't live in that little town anymore, right? There just were not enough opportunities to be a scientist in that little town. I had to go somewhere else and move out of that little town. And I think anadromy is like that. There's just not enough food in many of our freshwater ecosystems here in the lower 48 that a fish can remain in freshwater and grow large enough and have enough eggs to successfully reproduce.
Tom, I want to talk again about the organization a bit. And in my view, the strength of any organization is the people that are involved. Can you walk us through some of the key members of TCA?
Right. Well, this comment that was made earlier about the need for more anglers in fisheries management positions, I think is an interesting one. It's not to denigrate folks who aren't anglers, but there's definitely something to be said for that. And I look at the history of wildlife management, which overall has been far more successful than fish management has, as far as actually saving and stimulating wild populations of waterfowl and mammals, etc. Who is the father of modern wildlife management? Aldo Leopold, an avid grouse hunter in Wisconsin. We don't have an Aldo Leopold, not in that context anyway. But I think it's instructive that all the people who led the Kamchatka effort, pretty much, even the Russians, by the way, are anglers. Pete Salver, retired Navy captain who spearheaded the whole thing, avid angler, caught his first steelhead here on the Sauk River, tributary to the Skagit in 1969 on an Orvis bamboo rod. Jack Stanford, decorated, recognized as a foremost river morphologist from the University of Montana, as John pointed out, avid angler. Bill McMillan and many others who've guided over the years. And Kirill, the principal Russian scientist, Kirill was on an Atlantic salmon trip with me on the Kola Peninsula in 1995. And I well remember him lifting Yvon Chouinard up on his shoulders and wading across this relatively small river with, the head of Patagonia on his shoulder. It was quite hilarious. Not to belabor the point, we want all scientists, all citizen conservationists to join the cause. But I think our success in this effort, exemplified by Kamchatka and our colleague on this discussion right now, John McMillan, you feel the passion. These guys are serious anglers, serious steelhead and salmon anglers, and it drives them to a point beyond, with their passion and their dedication, beyond where simply somebody sitting at a computer analyzing numbers of returning salmon over Bonneville Dam, for us, that's not good enough. We want the drive. We want the drive of the steelhead. That's the spirit for us.
When it comes to premium flies that deliver results, Drifthook.com is the name to trust this season. Whether you're chasing trout with dry flies, swinging streamers, or dialing in those Euro nymphs, they've got everything you need. Here's a quick story. I was fishing a tricky spring creek earlier this year and nothing was working. Then I pulled out a Royal Wolf from the Drifthook box. I cast upstream, letting it drift effortlessly toward a holding fish. It was textbook. One of the biggest fish in the run rose, sipped the fly, and the fight was on. That's definitely a moment I'll never forget. Their fly kits ship free straight to your door, fully stocked and ready for action. You can support a great small business right now in this podcast by heading over to drifthook.com today. That's Drifthook, Drifthook. Use the code SWING at checkout to get 15% off your first order.
When I started in the bucket, that was something I was really curious to discuss with folks, because I know my own personal fascination with this fishing. And it's different than other types of fly fishing because the whole mental aspect of, let's call it optimism, one more cast, let's keep going, and paying attention to the weather, paying attention to conditions, and then the whole luck factor. It's really, really enchanting to me. And talking about Russia, which, for a lot of folks is a place they're never going to fish, so to hear these stories of this fishery, it's almost like science fiction, I suppose, or fantasy, because, it's not something your everyday Joe Bag of Donuts is going to be able to experience. But we do have fisheries that we can participate in that, give us the same sort of drive. And, one thing that I think is important is to understand our impact, our own personal impact as anglers, our own catch and release mortality, but also to understand the overall impacts to the fish, which is tough to do from an angler's perspective. This is the job of the managers. And I think in a lot of cases, this is where they failed quite brilliantly, is they say, okay, well, not enough fish, we'll take away the anglers. But they don't necessarily understand what the angling impact is, and they don't necessarily understand how the angling impact is different if a person fishes a certain way versus another. And, to me, one of the key things when we're talking about recovery is to understand, where we've lost fish. And I think the experience in Russia that I've heard you guys speak on with removing the poachers, I think key to that sounds like it was increasing the value of the fishery through recreational angling. And, to me, this is a model that needs to be explored more broadly here in the Pacific Northwest. What do you think, John?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is an interesting topic for the waters that you're living on right now, right? As I became aware of the bycatch, for example, of Skeena steelhead and some of these fisheries that are being prosecuted in the ocean along the coast of Alaska, likely occurring as these steelhead return home, right? The final stages of surviving this very difficult, daunting journey out to the open ocean, and here they are in the home stretches, and they're basically being sucked up, right, in a fishery that is focused on capturing something else. They are literally bycatch. I can't speak to what happens to those fish ultimately, but the point remains to me is that if you're going to maximize the value of an individual fish, if we are treating these fish as a commodity, for better or worse, right? Because a lot of our fisheries, that is the bottom line. What is the economic value that they provide rather than the social value? Although I think we would all argue there's a tremendous social value here. But let's focus on the economic part, which is, you're right, people are going to pay hundreds to thousands of dollars to travel to a place to have the opportunity to hook into one of these fish. Now, the fish that are captured as bycatch and probably tossed overboard, that's a tremendous loss of economic opportunity and value. And this does, to me, highlight one of the ways that I think we can improve the overall management of fisheries as a whole. Is a lot of these ocean fisheries, they're mixed stock, right? They don't know where the fish are ultimately returning that they're catching in their fishery. And also, many of these fisheries, particularly for Chinook, they're catching the fish when they're quite young and small, right? They're not allowing those fish to reach an old age and large size. So I'm not a fan scientifically and socially of these mixed stock fisheries, because I think they inhibit the recovery of these fish. And if we're spending billions of dollars to try and improve their habitat and remove dams and recover them, we've got to have a serious evaluation of the economic and social impacts of these open ocean mixed stock fisheries, because to me, there's some similarities if we go and look back at the recovery of waterfowl in North America. In the lower 48, recovery of waterfowl did not happen until they implemented the Migratory Bird Act, which basically eliminated market hunting. Now, commercial fisheries in and of themselves offer important economic value, social value, and they provide food. All of those are important. I don't want to eliminate commercial fisheries, but I do think commercial fisheries are best off occurring in terminal areas, right? Somewhere close to the river mouth where they know where the fish are going, or actually in freshwater when the fish have made their destination known. And if we can operate commercial fisheries in that manner, we have a more rigorous means of both estimating the number of fish that are caught and then determining where those fish were going. So it's not eliminating commercial fisheries. It's really trying to operate them in the most sustainable, well-managed way possible. And I think Bristol Bay sockeye offer us a good example. That fishery has been prosecuted for a long time. They know often where those fish are going, right? They're catching sockeye that are returning to Bristol Bay. But on the other hand, we have examples in the North Pacific where we have like the troll fishery off southeast Alaska. That fishery that is occurring in Alaska is taking mostly fish that are returning down here to the lower 48. So imagine all the investments that taxpayers are making, for example, in Puget Sound and the Columbia River. Imagine the cost that is incurring to Native Americans that have lived in the Columbia River Basin since time immemorial and now are paying the price because a lot of these fish are being over-harvested in the open ocean. But it's not just about the numbers of fish that are being harvested. It's that the size of Chinook salmon has greatly declined, right? We used to have quite a few 70 to 80, even 90, up to 100-pound Chinook salmon. Those are simply almost entirely missing from the North Pacific. Now, they're not completely gone, but they're largely disappeared. Our fish are younger and they're smaller. And we need to change how we manage our fisheries to allow Chinook salmon to rebuild and display that trait, because I think we talked about this last time. Every species has a superpower, right? You know, and if you applied that to like baseball, Mark McGwire hit home runs, Ricky Henderson stole bases, right? Everybody serves a role. Chinook salmon, they got to be big. And there's lots of big Chinook salmon down in South America. So it's not like this is just as simple as, oh, it's climate change, right? That doesn't make sense. There are huge Chinook salmon returning to South America. So this is one of the impetuses for us is we've got to reconsider how we manage Chinook salmon fisheries.
John, I got to ask, are you calling them Chinook for my benefit as a Canadian, or do you just always call them Chinook instead of Kings?
Yeah, always Chinook, and the reason is because where I grew up on the Washougal River, that was the Chinook tribe, right? That was the tribe. That's what they were called by the Europeans that arrived. And so for me, they've always been Chinook. Every now and then I do catch myself calling him a king salmon, but it's referred to as Chinook because where I grew up as a kid, that was the Native American tribe, the group of Native Americans. That's what they were referred to.
King salmon is an Alaska term.
Kings. My business partner, who currently lives in France, he just loves calling them king salmon. And, he thinks it's a very fitting description. And, I've always called them Chinook. And so we kind of use the terms interchangeably. When we started our business here on the Skeena, our focus was actually fishing for Chinook salmon. And at that time, that was a huge passion for me. I just love throwing it out there as far as I can with the heaviest gear I can throw and, getting that fish to grab it. Sometimes it's like they see it coming. As soon as it hits the water, starts to move. You're fishing heavy, but you're still kind of middle of the water column. And the grab of a Chinook salmon is so unique. But, unfortunately, in recent years, we've seen a loss of opportunity here on the Skeena for Chinook salmon fishing. What's very frustrating is these very same fish are harvested at Prince Rupert. These very same fish are harvested in recreational fisheries in Haida Gwaii. So essentially, we've traded off, in-river opportunity to allow the status quo harvest fisheries in the ocean without properly documenting that the impact in these, catch and release in-river fisheries is very, very small. and the economic benefit is really high. There's this funny thing, John, you and I talked about this the other day. There's this funny thing that the harder it is to catch a fish, the lower the catch rates, often the more people are willing to pay for the price to do that. So the privilege, and I think this is a natural thing for us as anglers, isn't it? We seek out fisheries that are more challenging. We seek out quality over quantity over time. Tom, I want to get into a little bit about your own fishing history. I know that you started out on the East Coast and then you found your way to the West Coast. You were fascinated with Atlantic salmon. You know, how did you become a steelheader? Was that an easy transformation from Atlantic salmon fishing?
I suppose so, relatively speaking. I'm an average fisherman at best, so it's not as if I regard myself as any great angler on either species. But as a kid growing up in New England, our Atlantic salmon, of course, had long ago been destroyed by and large. There were still some remnant runs in Maine, but for me, it was a matter of driving to Eastern Canada, to New Brunswick and Quebec and so forth. And so that's, as a teenager and a young man in my 20s, that's what I did. The same way a lot of folks now, of course, drive north to fish British Columbia for steelhead. Because even then, even on a day ticket basis, it still cost money to fish for salmon in those rivers in eastern Canada. I was only able to do it like once a year or so. So I sort of charting my personal future, I thought, well, I was editor of Trout Magazine by then. So I thought, well, I could fly back and fish for salmon once a year just as easily, but I could fish more often for steelhead. And so that kind of, on a real basic level, that motivated me to move to the West Coast. As far as my first experiences with steelhead, there were two, actually. One is the first steelhead I ever saw was on the Pere Marquette River in Michigan. Transplanted fish, obviously, caught on something called a Springs Wiggler, which was like a stonefly nymph, by some guy wielding this big, heavy glass rod. This is in the late 70s. Rubber waders, freezing your rear end off in the water. So my first encounter with steelhead was not a particularly attractive one. I thought, I don't think so. This isn't my cup of tea. However, a year or so later, I ended up in a drift boat in May floating the Toutle River. And the guy who was it wasn't a professional guide. It was a TU, a Trout Unlimited volunteer, bringing me down the river to show me, this kid from the East Coast, what real fishing was all about. And he was throwing eggs, borax eggs. First time I'd ever experienced anything like that, with a level wind reel. And he was very good at what he did. And I still have a slide somewhere, a picture of about not a terribly large one, particularly knowing what I now know, what was in that river historically, but it was like a 7 or 8 pound early run summer steelhead, Memorial Day time. Then after that, as a matter of fact, I bought John's dad's book, Dry Line Steelhead, at a fly shop, and I started, kind of dreaming about catching one on a fly. And then a year or so after that, I found there was a TU meeting out here in the Northwest, and I found myself camping on the Deschutes River the week before, and I caught one. And so that's essentially, it's nothing dramatic, but in that respect, it was a fairly easy switch. I just got out there with the same tackle that I had been using in Eastern Canada, floating fly line, and same flies, actually. I caught the first fish I caught, first steelhead I caught on a fly, was caught on a little sort of spay-looking pheasant deal that a couple of weeks earlier on the Teton in Quebec, I'd caught an Atlantic salmon on. So that's the only interesting part of my personal story, is I literally caught a salmon grilse, and on the same fly, a couple of weeks later, caught a steelhead on the Deschutes River.
Well, I think that illustrates greatly how, the culture and tradition techniques flies, especially associated with Atlantic salmon fishing, has influenced, steelheading culture, which is much newer, greatly, because, as you alluded to, most early steelheading was done with gear tackle. And, we've seen in this last 30 years, this tremendous increase of fly fisher and obviously spey anglers. And, it's a topic that comes up quite a bit in the bucket episodes is, how do you like to fish? Click and pawl versus disc drag, long belly, short belly, Skagit lines, whatever. The advancements in technique, we have a lot at our disposal to make fishing more pleasurable or easier. And, with that comes a management challenge. And one of those challenges is fly fishermen take up a lot of room. We fish below ourselves. Gear anglers, they, I think, enjoy the camaraderie of being within talking distance to each other and fishing primarily in front of themselves. So figuring out, how we can share the water. And another topic that's come up quite a bit, and I'm going to ask you because you kind of brought it up. In Eastern Canada, anglers are managed with a pretty heavy hand. Whereas, one of the draws of fishing here in the West is kind of go wherever you want. And Kenny Morrish, in a previous episode, brought this up. He said, man, I really enjoy the ZEC system, but at the same time, I'm kind of offended by it because it, takes away freedom. What are your thoughts, Tom? Do you think that, a ZEC type system could come west?
Yeah, well, this is this perspective that comes with turning 70, which I just did this past August. If you were to talk to anybody of my age in Eastern Canada about what they think of salmon fishing, they would tell you that there's more opportunity now there than there ever was in their lifetime, because before the ZEC system in Quebec and before other management changes in all the provinces, pretty much, Newfoundland, they couldn't fish. If you lived in Gaspé, Quebec, or Matapedia, Quebec, you could not fish. You were not allowed to. They were private rivers. The province leased those rivers to groups of private individuals, heads of timber companies, heads of mining companies, rich Americans from Wall Street. That's kind of an extreme description, but largely it makes the point, and it's largely true. So what happened is that during the 60s and 70s, as part of the quote unquote cultural revolution that touched everything from music to, clothing to feminism, everything, the common man in Eastern Canada, in your eastern provinces, sort of rose up and said, we want to fish these rivers. These are our rivers. So now the situation is such that it's controlled, yes, so it's not a free-for-all, but it allows the common person to go in and fish for, in some cases, as little as $50 a day. In some cases, on the more prize beats, on the Cascapedia, let's say we have a chance to catch a 30 or 40-pound salmon, it costs quite a bit more than that. But there's a whole range of opportunities. I guess it's the free market at its best, in a sense. If you want to go to McDonald's, you can go to McDonald's and you can eat and sustain yourself. If you want to go to Morton Steakhouse and have a 3-pound ribeye, it's not going to cost the same cost as a Happy Meal, right? And so fishing is the same way. That's the way I view it. So the people who think that it's restrictive, yes, it's restrictive, but do you want it restricted and have an opportunity to go there and catch fish and have relatively healthy runs? Or do you want to come and fish with me 15 minutes from where I live right now on the Skykomish and catch nothing? There's a free fishery for you.
John, Olympic Peninsula rivers, do you think a management strategy like the ZEC would be received in a positive way?
No, it would probably result in whole-scale conflict, right? And, this is an interesting discussion in and of itself, is so how well limited entry would be accepted here in the lower 48 on the West Coast is, I do think it is. There's a disdain that kind of drips out of an angler's mouth when you hear that proffered as a potential solution. Now, that said, I think one of the things that is a theme of our discussion today is that I can't tell you always what the solution is going to be based on science, because we haven't experimented, right, at big scales to figure out what happens when you turn these dials on fisheries, right? My point is that we should really open our toolbox, and then we need to monitor how effective, if they are effective, these changes can be. And so this is what one of the things that TCA wants to do is we really need to open up the toolbox, and then we need to collect the data in a way that provides us insight, right, into what works and what doesn't work. Now, when I think of a place like the Olympic Peninsula, where we're catching these fish often multiple times, and on average, right, in some cases, around 1.5 times the entire escapement is being caught in some years. But it's not only here. If you look to some of the data that the Department of Fish and Wildlife has collected in places like the Washougal and the Toutle, in some years, the scientists estimate they were catching the whole run 2 times. So we don't know what it is, but it's a lot, right? We're very effective at it. And I think of this as basically a free-for-all. Now, I will compliment the managers down here on the peninsula. When the run sizes have been small, they've eliminated boat fishing, right? They've taken steps. I think they've been more flexible than they have in the past, and I give them kudos for that. The department has done some really proactive things. Now, that said, I still think that, and we've talked about this, sometimes when run sizes are small, it just self-regulates, right? If there's a poor run and it's broadly known across social media, there's not a lot of fish, and the first anglers that go up to fish come back and tell their friends, I didn't really catch anything. Well, not many people are going to travel, get on a plane or a car and fly 1,000 miles or 100 miles and spend a few $1,000 to go fish. So I do believe that run sizes, when small, often self-regulate. The challenge to me comes when it's really good, right? What do we do in these good years? Because I grew up in a family where we lived paycheck to paycheck in a little mill town, and almost all the neighbors did. And generally what happens when you live paycheck to paycheck in a mill town is that when you get paid on Friday and you have a lot of money, you go out to the bar and you drink for the weekend and you spend all your money. And then by the time Tuesday or Wednesday comes around, you're like, shit, out of money almost, right? And you've got 10 more days until the next paycheck comes. And so this is one of the challenges too, is how do you manage your fisheries when the run sizes are doing relatively well? And I would like to refer back to a quote from Bill Ruckelshaus, and that is, nature provides a free lunch, but only if we control our appetite. And this comes down to being proactive so that we don't have to live paycheck to paycheck every year with our fisheries. I think of this down on the OP. Okay, so the last year was a better run than it had been the previous 3 to 4 years when runs were really poor. And this year is expected to be similar to last year. These are not, the Hoe had a good return, but overall, these are not great returns generally still, right? You're coming out from that pit. When I think of a ZEC-like system down here, a long-winded way to get at that is I don't think of a universal limited entry program. I look at the Skeena system as a more appropriate way. Those of us that live in Washington should have first access to these streams. We live here. We pay the local taxes. We're the ones that pay the cost if the fishery goes downhill, right? So when I think of potential for limited entry on a place like the Olympic Peninsula, it's that out-of-state, out-of-country people could pay more money. There could be tags for those people. Again, I'm not saying this is the solution I would implement, but these are the things that socially we could consider, and you could allow the anglers to basically make the determination on how they would like to see the fishery structured. So the main point is there should be a lot of options on the table rather than just closure or free-for-all, because free-for-all tends to end up in the tragedy of the commons, so to say, right? The manifest destiny, where we will overutilize the resources when they're super abundant because we're living paycheck to paycheck.
Do either of you guys have an example of a river that's been closed to angling and then seen some level of recovery?
So this is a great question. We have closed, I'll talk about this. So the only full-scale closures that have occurred over the long term that I'm personally familiar with the data before, during, and after are the winter steelhead streams in Puget Sound, right? So everywhere from, say, the Skagit down south through into the Nisqually River, those rivers were closed when the stocks were listed under the Endangered Species Act. And of those, the Skagit was closed for only a very short period of time. Now, the Skagit has essentially built back up to run sizes that are not as large as they were in the 80s or 90s, but their populations have become productive and abundant enough to now operate a spring fishery, a spring catch and release fishery. The Skykomish, the Puyallup, the Green, going down into the Nisqually, we really don't have, I would argue as a scientist, that we're not collecting data rigorously enough to really know what has happened to those populations. So they've been closed. Based on the best data we have, it doesn't look like there's been any positive rebound or effect from those closures. Now, that said, the Nisqually offers an interesting example because it has been closed for a long time, and its run size based on the red count surveys, which is the way we estimate how many steelhead escape to a watershed, those red counts suggested the population was down to, hundreds of fish, and it was remaining at a low, steady state for a long, long time. Now, Nisqually is a fairly large watershed. It should probably have at least a few thousand fish. Now, a local WFW scientist went out there and decided to conduct red counts in a much larger portion of the watershed than they had traditionally conducted. Those surveys revealed a much higher level of reds than they anticipated based on the small modicum of surveys that they had done before. And the population went from hundreds of fish up to about 1,500 fish. That was their estimate. 1,500 fish is a lot different than 500 fish, right? A 1,500 fish population, that's basically like the bogus heel out here. You can have a fishery over 1,500 fish.
John, I just want to make sure I understand. Are you suggesting then that they expanded the area of their survey so they were looking in places for reds that they hadn't previously been looking?
Correct. So this raised a question for me. I know it's also a question that other scientists have, is the red counts that were initially conducted in these Puget Sound streams. They were developed in anywhere from the mid 70s to the mid 80s. And those, we call them index reaches because they return to the same place year in and year out to do the surveys. Now, scientifically, we know the index reaches can produce a bias estimate, and that is why almost all agencies have went to what they call a rotating panel design, where they implement a random sample across the watershed, so they're not surveying the same reaches every year, and they will do some of the same reaches every year, but they will rotate those annually across a decade. So basically you have what they call a stratified random sample design. Now, the Department of Fish and Wildlife is not doing that for winter steelhead in Puget Sound, but the Nisqually expansion of red counts to new unsurveyed areas suggests that there may be more fish than the department thinks there are in some of these watersheds. So to get back to you, does closure in and of itself, has that resulted in clear results of more fish going to the spawning grounds and then later turning into a fishery? I don't think we really have that information. I don't think it's clear. And one of the reasons this likely hasn't happened is because it's really unclear whether catch and release in and of itself at the levels that we are talking about in many watersheds is having a statistically significant impact on the productivity of the population.
Let's talk mortality rate for a second, John. Obviously, lots of science out there on this, at a variety of species, variety of locations. I personally tend to throw around the 5% number. I know a lot of folks use 10%. On an individual encounter, what do you think your own personal impact is when you're out there swinging flies for winter steelhead?
So it's a great question. As a kid, if I have data from the first steelhead that I caught on my own at age 12, right? And now I'm 53. So statistically, my mortality rate in terms of letting a fish go that's bleeding, it looks like it's going to die, right? It swims away impaired and might go belly up. Maybe it's already dead. It's somewhere around 1.5%, right? Statistically, that's the number of fish that I end up directly killing from my interaction. But what is interesting is that when I fished spoons for winter steelhead, my mortality rate using a spoon with, say, a size 1 to a 1/0 hook was really low for big fish, but quite high for little fish, right? So if these fish were, say, 22 inches and less, it was not uncommon to have that larger hook go through their eye, right, and result in some type of mortality. So bigger fish mortality was low, but smaller fish on my spoon was high. And then, of course, my mortality rates dramatically increased when I continued to fish in my home river, the Washougal, as a teenager when water temperatures got above 70 degrees. And I was a kid, right? We talk about this. We all have to learn our own conservation ethic and what our impact is through trial and error. And my mortality rates when the temperature got above 70 degree for summer steelhead could get up there to 15, 16% at their peak.
Tom, do you think this is talked about enough? Do you think individual anglers need to be more aware of their impacts?
Yes, I do. I think it should be talked about. Anglers should be aware. I think we are collectively a lot more aware than we used to be. Smaller to medium-sized hooks, barbless, I think has made a significant difference.
So guys, one thing I was going to ask earlier, but I'll throw it out there now. For a person that likes to fish, how do they get involved with your organization? Is there an opportunity there?
Yeah, so, we're going through a transition, Brian, and this is where we have, as you and I have talked about, and Tom and I have talked about, and we've discussed with our board is, what do we want to look like moving forward? And we haven't finished this transition. It's going to unfold over the next 1 to 2 years as we hone in on what we think we do well, the areas that we really truly want to focus on in terms of our impact. But right now, like any NGO, we always need support, right? We can't go out and do the work that we do to try and conserve fish or improve opportunities by ensuring that agencies open up their toolbox unless we have financial support. So we're a small group. We don't have a really large team. As we talk about this, we don't get money from the federal government for habitat work, and large foundations generally do not want to support the type of work that we do. So we are either almost solely funded from individual anglers that care about the fish, the fisheries, and the way we manage them and whether we're going to have these fisheries into the future. So go to www.theconservationangler.org. There is a link there where people can give to us. We're in the process of revamping our website because the KSP program doesn't look promising right now. We're going to...
John, I got to ask, I'm sorry, what is KSP program?
Sorry, that's the Kamchatka Steelhead program. So we refer to it as KSP. And since our work has now come home to North America, we've got to revamp our website, right? We've got to prioritize things now in a way that we haven't necessarily had to do before. We have a scientist, myself on staff. We have a lawyer. Of course, we'd always love to get things done proactively. Sometimes we do need to litigate. Litigation can cost money. But that said, our focus moving forward is really simple. It's trying to save wild steelhead and salmon with a very strong focus on Chinook. And as we talk about recovering steelhead, managing salmon is important to recovering steelhead because steelhead depend on salmon for food. They provide the eggs and flesh that steelhead need. And so my own takeaway from all of this is that no single tool is going to recover wild salmon or steelhead. In the science world, in the conservation world, down here in the lower 48, we have what we call the 4 H's: habitat, harvest, hydropower, and hatcheries. We need to align all of those H's so that they're working together and not against one another. And from our perspective at TCA, we cannot save all of the places and all of the populations. They simply are not equally altered or depleted. And so we are trying to hone in on those best last remaining places to do complementary work where other people are focused on saving and protecting and restoring habitat.
So let me ask you this, John. When you look at Russia, and I know you were pretty transparent that your draw to the group initially had a lot to do with getting over there and being part of that effort. And Tom, you talked about the lessons learned over there and the experience. Regular listeners to this show might have heard me talk about the One Red Paperclip story. Have you guys heard the story about One Red Paperclip?
No.
Okay. It's interesting.
We always like a good story in case you haven't noticed.
So when I was in Whistler, I knew a girl, and she actually is the owner of the One Red Paperclip. She was the first trade. And the story goes a little bit like this. There was a gentleman who had a very simple red vinyl-coated paperclip, And his goal was to make a series of trades. And I think it was 12. I can't remember. It was less than 15. But his goal was his final trade was going to be for a house. So he was going to trade up every time. Essentially, he was going to take what he had and increase the value of it by passing it along. And to me, it's an interesting philosophy because I look at the work you guys have done in Russia and you say, okay, well, what do we have there? Okay, well, this has some value. And then you bring that over here and you trade it up essentially to apply those lessons learned and that experience you have to the benefit of the fishery here. And I think that's really unique. And, the NGO landscape, as we've discussed, is well populated. So what sets your organization apart? And what I've learned today is that it's angler-based, that it's not about losing access, it's about finding a way to maintain access, because every time we close a fishery, there's a waterbed effect, and it just pushes anglers to other areas and increases the impacts to those fisheries. So I think that, for me, I'm excited to learn more and to watch your story unfold as we try and organize anglers to the benefit of the fish, and also put, like you said, John, put more tools in the toolbox, help the people that manage the fisheries make decisions that increase value and promote sustainability. And hey, look, everybody that fishes loves to fish. That's why we do it, right? And, I think that you guys have a great name, the conservation angler, because anglers don't want to be part of the problem. They want to be part of the solution. And certainly I think that's what, drives folks like yourselves. And Tom, I've mentioned this to you before offline, but, that large format Wild Steelhead and Salmon magazine, that was really formative for me. I got my hands on copies of those in the mid-90s when I was guiding for a gentleman named Jim Repine in South America. And I'd done a little bit of steelhead fishing before that, but reading stories about Ed Ward and, the way you documented the culture around swinging flies, when I got home, I just dove right into this stuff. And obviously it's helped shape my life. So I want to thank you for that. And I hope that in some way this podcast accomplishes something like that on a smaller scale. It encourages people to get out there and explore their own backyard and find ways to better understand their impacts and also to promote sustainability in the fisheries that matter to them. So before we wrap up here, I'm going to ask you guys a couple of fishing related questions, but I also want to give you an opportunity right now to do a little bit more promoting of your organization with an idea of the future, where you see the group moving in the next 2 years. John, I'll let you go first, and just go for it and let folks know how, as you said, if they want to get involved, they can. What type of role do you see the angling public playing in the future with your group?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing I've talked about this a few times, we're going to move away from talking about closing recreational fisheries, even when runs are low. We're going to try now and refocus our efforts. Because I'm an angler, and I really don't think closures are going to get you anywhere. And a great example is on the OP. This last year, the fishery is going to occur. The department would like to allow more boat fishing to expand those opportunities. But they want to close the steelhead fishery at the end of March. Our proposal is to eliminate boat fishing, or at least restrict it, provide some areas to boat fishing, but shorten those up so we don't catch as many fish, and have the fishery open through April. It makes more sense to us to have more conservative, longer seasons, basically more opportunity. That month of April is always an amazing time to be on the river when kind of all the trees are starting to bloom. As Bill Herzog says, you start to smell those cottonwood trees, right? It's amazing. So that's an example of the first part of our transition, right, is that we're going to move away. The former ED had at times pushed for some closures. We're not going to do that anymore, right? We're going to try and find opportunities. We also want to implement good science projects. We believe that good science is fundamental to learning about the fish and the different management actions we can take. I've been a part of the Elwha Dam Removal Project. I think dam removal projects are absolutely critical to recovering salmon. There's one that's occurring in the Klamath River right now, where groups like Cal Trout and Trout Unlimited have played a really key role. We think these are important. We would like to help participate in conducting science on steelhead and other dam removal projects. But we'd also like to broaden our efforts. Last is to try and do angler science-based projects like we had in Kamchatka. We think that agencies have limited budgets, and agencies can't go out and sample all the fish that anglers can. So there's a free source of sampling out there that anglers are doing. We think that we could like to harness that power and those sample sizes by collaborating and connecting agencies with anglers. so that we can do things like collect scales, get DNA samples, maybe tag fish. But all of this information is out there and exists, and we're not taking advantage of it. So that's something else we'd like to do. But last is when fundamentally and absolutely necessary, as evidenced by our work in the North Umpqua, if we have to take legal action to protect one of the best last remaining rivers, we will do that. And that's unfortunate. But we also know that we have laws in place to ensure that agencies protect fish. And the last resort for us is to force agencies under law to protect those fish. So we think there are a suite of actions that we can take. Again, we're not really focused on trying to get habitat protected or restored. A lot of groups do that. We're going to try and provide a complementary aspect that we think is fundamentally important, which is to shift our focus towards improving opportunity, ensuring agencies open up their toolbox, trying to conduct good science across the geographic range of steelhead, and then trying to harness the power of anglers to collaborate more with agencies to get good science.
Tom, do you have anything to add to that?
I would say simply that the conservation angler is your voice. There are many organizations doing habitat work, and we support them all individually and collectively, but we are the tip of the spear representing steelheaders.
I love that. As I think we're going to discuss becoming a membership-based organization, I've long looked up to the Rough Grouse Society, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever. There is a Trout Unlimited, right? There is. But we care about steelhead and chinook. That's all we care about, right? Those are the two fish that we fundamentally love. It doesn't mean we don't work on the others, but those are the two things we love. But at our core, we're steelheaders. We are steelheaders.
I love it. Now, I want to reference a couple previous episodes where we got talking about some crazy ideas. I think the one I did with April Vokey and Tim Arsenault. I think the one I did with Stevie Morrow and Justin Miller, who you guys may know from the fly shop there in California. And I feel like I maybe talked to Bunky and Dax and Kenny about this too. But the Thompson River, very near and dear to my heart. I used to spend a ton of time there. Everybody knows the Thompson's seen a drop in fish numbers. And what we've lost there as well is the very unique culture that was around fishing the Thompson. And what we said is, hey, if I was in charge, I wouldn't have closed the thing. I would have taken away the hooks. I would have said, hey, you can still come and fish, but you can't use a hook. And this sounds crazy to someone who doesn't do it. But if you think of the idea of fishing a dry fly, skating it through that water and seeing those fish come up and they don't get hooked, everything else that's great about the Thompson's still there. The camaraderie, and the angler's still, contributing financially, the social benefit. That fishery means a lot to a lot of people. And my concern today is that when the numbers are sufficient again based on the test fishery, which is likely to happen at some point, and the folks in charge of managing that fishery decide to let anglers back in, there's a lot of people that haven't fished it before that are going to want to show up. And if there's a scenario, with all due respect, guys, what I call an American-style opening, where instead of opening it early, they wait until they have a high confidence that the fish are there, and then suddenly, drop the rope and everybody can fish, and boom, those fish just get hit over the head with everything. No gear restrictions, no nothing, no area restrictions. I don't think that's a great management tactic. Whereas, had we kept the angler, the consistency of the anglers visiting the place, the culture around it, in a way that had literally no impact, no hooks, I think we'd be in a far better place to understand what was going on. And perhaps, I know it's not science, John, but if you went out there and you had 10 fish come up and eat your fly, you might say, oh gosh, maybe there's some more fish around. In that episode, John, we did fairly recently, and this was kind of unique. I mean, I've always felt In the Bucket was going to have guests that showed up multiple times, but I never anticipated I'd have them show up as close as your two episodes. I mean, you were on in number 11 there with Bob Hooton and Brian Morrison. When we were talking about, the management of the Skeena in particular, really unique discussion to have with Bob there, because he was the guy that brought in catch and release. You brought up this point of pink salmon, and you and Bob had a fantastic discussion about, the potential impacts of, essentially we'll call it too many fish in the sea. I wanted to get into that a little bit right now before we finish up here, because it was a really interesting discussion. I've had a lot of feedback from folks who listened to that episode. And, I feel like it was recent enough that we should also bring Tom into it. I'm sure he's got some thoughts. So just to recap, let folks know the concern with the pink salmon, please.
Sure. And before I do that, I want to hit back that I think this no-hooked fly is an interesting concept. My dad started doing that back in the 80s when he felt he was just catching too many fish. Maybe he's a little bored. During the two most recent really bad returns here on the OP, people would see me fishing out there, and probably 30-40% of those days I had just clipped the hook off. It's just fun to get the grab. So I think you're right. It may sound strange and unusual, but we should go to all extremes, right? And there's nothing wrong with doing that. So I like those ideas. They're out of the box. They're creative. Let's not throw everything away. Now, with the pink salmon, there's been extensive, or I will now call it an emerging and growing body of literature that suggests there are so many pink salmon in the North Pacific that there is really clear data that they're having a wide range of impacts, adverse impacts on the growth and survival of every species from coho salmon to sockeye and steelhead and chinook. And pink salmon provide a relatively strong statistical opportunity to come to these conclusions because they have this alternating life history, right? They're really abundant in an odd or even year, depending on where you live, and then far less abundant in the other year because they have a relatively fixed life history where they spend basically a year in the ocean. And so these alternating biennial patterns of abundance allow for what we call a natural experiment. Really abundant in one year, hardly any the next year. And what we see are really strong patterns, even in everything from diatoms to plankton. So the bottom of the food chain, right? These very small microorganisms that provide food that are critical from everything from shrimp and squid to mackerel. So all these other larger food sources that chinook and steelhead, even coho depend on, are being fed from the bottom of the food chain. And pink salmon enter the ocean at a very, very small size, right? Basically, they head right out to sea after they emerge from the egg and the gravel. They go out. So they're eating these very small microorganisms. And I recently did a review of 206 hatchery papers and published that. I think there were about 30 papers that evaluated the effects of too many salmon in the North Pacific, and most of those found an adverse impact. A lot of that research has been done by a scientist named Greg Ruggiero, but he is not the only one. This has been built upon by a wide range of people. The effects appear so expansive that we're even finding fairly strong correlations with decreased survival of steelhead in the Clearwater River, bee-run fish. Decreased growth of bee-run fish are correlated with pink salmon. We're seeing decreased kelp survival, which is decreased survival of repeat spawners with Olympic Peninsula steelhead. And we're seeing negative associations with Chinook salmon down here in the lower 48. More importantly to BC people is those Thompson River fish are strongly negatively correlated. Their survival is strongly negatively correlated with pink salmon in the North Pacific. Now, all of these pink salmon are not hatchery, but substantial numbers of them are. And a lot of those hatchery pink salmon in the North Pacific are coming out of Prince William Sound in Alaska. And this has become more controversial up there as people in Alaska are kind of divided. Should we continue to release so many pink salmon out of Prince William Sound? Or are those releases coming at such a great cost to our wild stocks that we need to really dial those back? So for us at TCA, this is a very, very big concern. There are so many pinks in the North Pacific. They're having a wide range of adverse impacts. And not only on fish, they're finding negative associations with different species of seabirds and even humpback whales.
You know, it's all tied into that Exxon Valdez. I mean, you know that background. That's where that money came from.
Can you go into a little more detail there about the Exxon Valdez relationship?
I can provide a little bit more, and this is interesting to me because Exxon Valdez basically ran ashore and dumped a bunch of oil into the Prince William Sound, and so people were, as you're aware, Brian, in the Cheekamus, right? This is a parallel story here, a parallel example where the oil was dumped in. There was great concern that was going to have a lot of adverse impacts on the fish, and one of the major fisheries there is for pink salmon. So after that spill, there was an effort to provide funding to produce large numbers of hatchery pink salmon, and that's kind of grown over time, and it's never ceased. So the Exxon Valdez, whether or not the pollution was so extensive to have long-term impacts, that happened in 1989, right? That was a long time ago. So here we are now, right? Well, after all of those potential pollutants have dissipated and gone away, and they're still relying on these hatchery pink salmon. And so I think, your experience in the Chicamus provides another parallel to this, right? Maybe that you could speak to.
Yeah, quite briefly, the Checamus incident that John's talking about was a rail spill, caustic soda into the Checamus River, and there was a considerable amount of money that was put into recovery. In that situation, a lot of it went into habitat, things like large woody debris structures. There was a small-scale hatchery component to that recovery, which very interestingly proved quite conclusively that the best tactic, if the habitat was there, was to let the wild fish do their thing, because those hatchery fish came back at a much lower rate of survival than the wild fish that everyone was concerned were going to disappear. And it just speaks to the resiliency of steelhead as a species, doesn't it? And the varied life history, and just one of you guys mentioned it earlier, just this idea of, hey, if the habitat's there, the fish know how to spawn, they know how to use it. We just got to let them do their thing. So, guys, before we wrap up, I want to ask you a couple questions. I always like to finish off the show asking some fun fishing questions. And I'm going to give you the opportunity, if you want to take it, to promote, yourselves individually, whatever that looks like. And if you want people to, have the ability to reach out to you, let them know how to do that. But I also, out of personal interest, want to ask you a couple fishing questions. So here they go. I'll give them to you, 2 questions, both at the same time. You guys can answer them one after another, and then let people know how to contact you if possible. John, I will start with you. In the episode we did with Bob, he spoke, quite passionately about your underwater photography. And, since then I went and did a bit of a deep dive on that. And he's right. The images you've captured of these fish doing their thing is something that everyone needs to check out. So make sure you mention that. So here's my 2 questions fishing wise. What fishery, what's the next fishing that you individually are looking forward to participating in? What gets you all jazzed up right now? What fishing trip are you planning? And the second thing is, and I've asked this to too many people because it's a topic that comes up a lot, steelhead fishing, disc drag or click and pawl? John, you go first.
Yeah, so, I'm excited for our winter steelhead fishery on the OP, right? That's the reason I live up here. I'm excited for that. But if you talk about visiting someplace, I'm excited to go down and see what the Klamath River looks like right after removing these dams. And I don't know that I'll be fishing it, but as somebody who just enjoys fish, right, I'm excited to see what that looks like. So OP winter steelhead, and click and pawl in the summer, drag in the winter.
Okay, and folks want to reach out to you, how can they do that? Or if they want to check out your photos, please.
Sure. So I'm on Instagram, rainforest_steel. I've also am getting close to starting a photography website. And, I've got a podcast I do with my colleague, Nick Chambers. And sometimes we've got to have you on there, Brian. And that is called the Deep Wade Podcast, can be found on all of the normal, locations where you find this wonderful podcast. So yeah, rainforest_steel on Instagram is probably the best place to find me.
Thank you.
Wow. I'm looking forward to getting back to Cuba, a place I've been several times over the years. Buy my books, wildriverpress.com.
It's steelhead fishing. Are you fishing a click and pawl, or are you a disc drag guy?
Yeah, same story. When I fish a Berkheimer 13-footer, when I fish a T-bore disc drag reel with that. And when I rarely anymore, when I do fish a single-handed rod, it's with an old Hardy St. John.
Right on. Hey, guys, I've really enjoyed talking to you. I'm looking forward to learning more about the conservation angler and hoping to find a way to participate. Really appreciate you coming on today and talking to everybody. And, hope to see you on the water sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
All right, folks, what an informative discussion with Tom and John to start our second season of In the Bucket. Thank you to everyone that has taken the time to reach out with comments and guest suggestions. I appreciate the feedback. I'm excited to put this season's shows together, bringing you a bunch of interesting new guests, as well as having some of our previous guests back too. Once again, I want to thank Tom and John for joining us today, and of course all the folks tuning in. I hope today's show inspires you to check out the Conservation Angler and perhaps getting involved. We recently announced our Wet Fly Swing Steelhead School and giveaway taking place this August 30th through September 3rd at Skeena Riverside Wilderness and Lodge. I'll be joined by the legendary Jeff Liskay, host of the Great Lakes Dude podcast, also available here on the Wet Fly Swing Network. If you're looking to take your fishing and casting to the next level, you should try and get in on this trip, as we will have one lucky winner joining us for free and getting a superb prize package from our sponsors. If you've enjoyed listening to John McMillan on In the Bucket number 11 and today's episode, you'll be really pleased to learn that John will be joining Jeff and I on the Skeena for this event. Please reach out if you would like more information on the trip, and don't forget to enter the contest. Check out the Wet Fly website or email me directly at info@skeenaspay.com for more details. Please feel free to reach out anytime if you have questions or comments on our show. You can find In the Bucket Podcast online at www.inthebucketpodcast.com. If you're on Instagram, and you can follow us at In the Bucket Podcast. We have a really fun episode coming your way next month, especially if you like swinging dry flies for steelhead. Until then, I'm Brian Niska, and you've been listening to In the Bucket, brought to you by the Wet Fly Swing.